Okay, something else we really wanted to talk about is a couple of issues that we've encountered with virtual game cards and just the user interface in general, which it's troublesome, it's annoying, and shouldn't really be like this. But hopefully, it can be fixed. Oliver, I've read your notes here; they're exhaustive. Let's go
Yes.
through them.
I'll try to explain this as best I can. I'll have some examples on screen. It's a little bit convoluted, but I'll try to get through it. So basically, they have this new system called virtual game cards, right? Which is conceptually how you manage, how you download games onto the Switch 2 system, onto the Switch 1 system as well, as of the May 2025 update. So it adds a ton of complexity. So basically, before, you had games on your system and games you didn't, right? Now you have games on your system and games you don't have in your system, and games you have loaded as a virtual game card, and games you don't have loaded as a virtual game card. So you have to manage these two separate states, these binary states, at the same time on your system, which adds a lot of complexity. So when you go into the system interface, when you click that Show More button, which I think used to be called Show All button on the right-hand side of that main interface, the default view is all the games you've ever downloaded to your system. You have to go into a sub-menu to see games you've just got downloaded right now. That means you're seeing a mix of downloaded games and not downloaded games by default, which feels really counterintuitive. I have 450 games, so this is a super annoying thing to have to scroll through this list, which has games that I've not gone on my system, games that I've gone on my system. Basically, I have all my games in that menu by default. It's quite annoying. And even if I did want to download or delete every single icon that I don't have on my system and delete them from virtual game cards, then that means that I can't add the games to my groups menu, which is really important because when you have as many games as I do, and when Nintendo makes interface navigation as clunky as this, you really need to have a lot of groups. So in theory, I can add them via virtual game cards first, then cancel the download, then I can add them to my groups. But then if I delete them from virtual game cards, it also deletes them from my groups, so I'm ruining it the whole time through, right? It's really, really annoying. And there's also no way to stop the virtual game cards downloads at once. So if you let's say you have a new system or you're trying to load a virtual game cards into your system, you have to load them 30 game cards at a time. But you can't stop all the downloads at once. You have to either go through it manually or wait until your storage fills up, and then you can click a button and stop all downloads, right? So that's really, really annoying. Virtual game cards, ultimately, it's a functionality I didn't ask for, I didn't need. I have virtually zero need to have two systems that can be connected, that don't have to be connected to the internet at any given time, that can share games between them. That is a problem that I do not have. In practice, the solution to me is unloading games that you aren't playing, but then you're destroying your group settings, and groups are the only way that I can keep this at all manageable. So that's really annoying. There are definitely things they could improve about it, but I think the concept of making people manage a digital licensing system separately from the ability to download games is just really complex and introduces a lot of hassle. It's just a drag on the experience. If I'm struggling with it conceptually, and if I'm struggling with it as a matter of implementation, imagine how like a kid or a stressed parent would manage. I think this thing is just really way more complex than it needs to be for its own good. And ultimately, like the thing you get with it is you can enable digital licensing in the system settings to be able to connect to the internet with your console and be able to play the games on your console without having the virtual game card loaded. The problem is they don't let you go back to the old interface. So no matter what, I'm still dealing with this clunky virtual game card interface. I cannot go back to the old system, which, while it had its foibles, it was fine. And this digital licensing system that Nintendo had before was very similar to the digital licensing systems that are used by Sony and Microsoft. It is a sensible digital licensing system with a primary console, with secondary consoles. That is the better way to go. And I'm really disappointed they removed that functionality. It's really annoying. If you only have like 20 games or something, or if you have a primarily physical library like John does, I don't think it's a huge issue. But for me, it's a gigantic problem with my 450 digital games. It's super, super annoying. And then in addition, there are a couple issues that aren't related to VGC. Like there's no filters anywhere in the system for Switch 1 games and Switch 2 games. In the Show More menu or in the VGC menu, and the cross-platform games, they oftentimes show no indication whether they're Switch 1 or Switch 2. They never show any kind of graphical indication on the box art, on the image, whether they're Switch 1 or Switch 2. Sometimes they have a Switch 2 edition next to them or something. That's the case with many titles. But like for Hogwarts Legacy, for instance, which is a title I have on Switch 1 and Switch 2, there's no indication that one is Switch 1 or Switch 2, unless you've memorized the artwork, which is slightly different between the two. There's no Switch 2 edition, there's no Switch 2 icon. It's the exact same game, basically, with very similar artwork, very hard to tell them apart. And this is a huge pain, and I think it'll become even more problematic over time. As we move more into the Switch 2 era, we have more Switch 2 software. It's going to be harder to keep track of it. You can do manual work with groups if you want to keep track of this, again, within the foibles of the VGC card interface. But I wish Nintendo would just add a filter for it, like Sony does. And in general, if they just added more filters to their interface to make it more manageable, like is the case in the PS5 interface, like is the case in the Xbox interface, where you have some degree of sortability through those different platforms that games arrive on. So just a few problems. I hope that the visuals on screen make it kind of make sense here. But they've just basically added a number of really irritating frictions to the experience, especially for people who have like unreasonably large Switch 1 libraries. And I know several other people who are in the same boat as me and who are having issues with this. So I just wanted to flag that Nintendo really needs to fix this problem, in my opinion, because it is slightly infuriating that they downgraded the experience so much from Switch 1, again, for players who do have large libraries to manage.
Yeah, in actual fact, I'm struggling to think of any advantages of the virtual game card versus how things were. What do you think, John?
I do think there's one advantage, and it's a small one and not something applicable yet. But so with the original Switch, the idea here is that sometimes, let's say you had multiple Switch units, right? Like a Switch Lite. I would have, like, say my Switch OLED as the primary system, and then say I was traveling, getting on a plane somewhere, and I wanted to bring the Switch Lite. The problem is any digital games on the non-primary system would need to connect to the server to use them. So the the virtual game card lets you essentially lend it out to the system you're going to take with you on the go, which is cool. But that's the only benefit. And on Switch 2 software, it doesn't matter yet because there is no Switch 2 revision. There will be, but not yet. And like you said, Oliver, I mean, my library is mostly physical anyway, so it hasn't been a huge problem. But that doesn't mean I haven't also experienced some frustration, specifically with so I did not do the system transfer thing. I didn't actually have enough SD card space to do it initially because I didn't get the SD card right away. I do have it now. So I was kind of doing things manually. The problem is like on my Switch OLED, a lot of games are just like considered virtual game carded, I guess, already, right? And if I want to install it on the Switch 2, it needs to remove it from the Switch OLED and allow it to load on the Switch 2. Problem is, even like half the time, even if I have the Switch OLED right there, it's turned on, it's connected to the internet, the Switch 2 will just say, "Oh, the Switch, it's not online. You need to be online. Get it online," and it doesn't work. It just fails over and over again. The workaround is to go onto the Switch OLED and remove the virtual game card from the Switch OLED side, and then it pops up on the Switch 2. But even then, it still pops up, even though it works, it still pops up an error message saying, "Oh, we couldn't do this. The operation failed because the system was offline." And I have no idea why, and it's driving me nuts. So, like, the whole thing of, like, if I just want to install a game that I had in my digital library, I got to jump through these hoops every freaking time now. And I can't figure out why it's acting this way, but it does not work reliably at all, and it's made the whole virtual game card system kind of unusable right now for me.
I think there are things that Nintendo can definitely do to improve this system. I'm sure if you addressed me and John's complaints, those are addressable complaints. But I also think just separately, it is a conceptually challenging concept of a system to have to manage these two categories of games. And some games you downloaded aren't loaded on your system and you can play them offline. Some are loaded that you can play them online but aren't downloaded to your system. Vice versa. It gets very, very complex here. So I think this is a kind of interface that even someone like Sony or Microsoft might struggle to implement. I don't think with Nintendo's history with these kinds of console interfaces, they're probably the best suited to deliver this kind of experience. And I don't think ultimately the experience is satisfactory for the end user. I don't see a ton of people clamoring for this feature. I don't see a ton of people for whom this feature is like a game changer. Maybe it is a game changer for some individuals, but like if it is a big deal, for instance, for a family to have this feature, the difficulties of managing it are intense, right? Even for one user potentially. For multiple users, multiple systems, understanding this, conceptualizing this, making this work, I think it's going to prove too hard for a lot of people. So I'd encourage them to at least give me a toggle to go back, all the way back. if they can, that'd be nice. But yeah, it's a pain at the moment.